and welcome to another episode of the Private Practice Growth Club YouTube channel. Today, I have a topical issue which comes up a lot in Facebook groups, in my DMs. I see this question get asked a lot, and it's all about buying and selling a practice. I've been searching for a while to speak to somebody who is an expert in this topic, and I'm really glad that I finally found somebody, a South African person who knows the South African market and knows the South African business mindset, and that's Graham. Graham is a chartered accountant with 2 decades in financial services experience, including years of involvement with startups and business development activities for large and small entities. With experience across several countries, Graham's biggest frustration is services that are too complicated and too expensive for entrepreneurs. Co-founding Bizval was a direct response to that friction in the market to make valuation services affordable and accessible to entrepreneurs. Thank you so much, Graham. I'm so glad I found you, and I'm so excited for this conversation we're going to have.
Thanks, Tasneem. It's lovely to be here, and thanks for having me. And hopefully we can kind of illuminate, what I think is often perceived as being a very difficult to understand concept. And as we'll go through it today, it really isn't. So the objective today is really to kind of unpack valuations, particularly for medical practice owners and medical practitioners, in a way that is easy to understand and help them make better decisions around how they plan for their future, whether it's selling their business or practice or not.
So before we get into the topic of valuation, can you just tell us a little bit about Bizval? What is it that Bizval does?
100%. So, I think, as you said, that sounded like a really elaborate bio about me. So I always cringe when somebody does that. But in a nutshell, what Bizval does is we help business owners, and a business owner can be somebody running a fish and chip shop, through to a medical practitioner. Anybody who's got their own business, we help them understand what their business is worth. And we do that in an easily understandable and affordable way. So think of us as being like I'll use a medical analogy, right? If you go to your GP and your GP treats you for something and you need to get a blood test done, think of us as almost being like the pathologist for business owners when it comes to evaluations. So you send it off, we assess the blood, or in this case, assess your business and tell you what it's worth and where there's some gaps in it, if there's some problems, are you healthy, are you not, all of that. So in a nutshell, that's what Bizval does. And we love working directly with entrepreneurs. It's not intimidating like going to a big auditing firm or something like that, and relatively affordable for business owners. So that's what we do in a nutshell.
I'm glad you mentioned, that it's affordable and it's not this big expense, because my experience so far from the social listening is that a lot of times when people are buying or looking to sell a practice, they don't even think about approaching an expert to do a valuation. Maybe they have an accountant already and they just ask the accountant to give them a valuation. But for the majority, they just kind of make up their own number. I don't know from where they get the number, but because I think the assumption is that having an expert valuation is going to be too costly. So perhaps we can start there with what is a valuation of a business, and why is it important to have one done when you are looking to buy or sell a practice?
Great question. So let me just talk about, in general, why are the reasons people might have a valuation, and then I'm going to talk briefly around how a business is valued, because if you understand that, then I think it brings a lot of understanding. So typically people would want a valuation for 3 reasons. One is they trying to raise equity. They're trying to get somebody to invest in their business or their practice. Okay. So that would be one reason why you would need a valuation. So it's like buying a home, right? If you want to get a bond to buy a home, you need to understand what the property is worth. So if you want to get somebody to invest in your business or your practice so you can grow it, you might need a valuation. Number 2 is if you want to sell your business. So, if you're thinking of selling your practice, you need to know actually what is it worth? What is somebody prepared to pay? And then thirdly, if you're growing your business or you're growing your practice, you kind of need to understand, are the efforts you're making to grow your practice actually adding to the value of that practice? So just because you're seeing more patients, you could halve your kind of consulting rate. You might just be working harder and not making any more money. So why are you doing that? And then there's a bunch of other reasons why you might need a valuation to know what your business is worth. Is Now, let's say you're in partnership with somebody and one of your partners decides they want to go off and become a doctor in Australia, for argument's sake. And you might need to buy them out the practice. So that might be a reason why you need a valuation. And then importantly, people often tend to forget there's things like insurance. So if something happens to you, and particularly in medical sphere, this is important. You have this concept of key man insurance. So what happens if something happens to you and you can no longer practice as a doctor or a physio, or whatever the case might be? That's known as sort of key man insurance. And when you insure for that, you need to know what your business is worth so that you're insured for the right amount. So there's a bunch of different reasons why understanding the value of your business is important. Again, I love to use analogies, and in the medical world, think a bit of it like, and I probably shouldn't use any brand names here, but we all know these sort of assessments. What is your biological age versus your actual age? And you need to know what that is. If your biological age is 40 and you're 50, you're doing well, you're exercising well, you're eating well, and you're doing all the right things. If you're 40 and your biological age is 50, well, then you need to make some adjustments. So think of evaluation of your business as almost a health check on your business. Are you doing well, or do you need to make changes? I think moving on to the second part of the question is, what is a business valuation? How do you value a business? Now, essentially, the value of the business is forward looking by nature. It's not looking backwards. Okay. So it's not looking and saying, to use a medical thing again, it's kind of saying, like, how long am I going to live? Okay. And what's the quality of my life going to be from here on out, as opposed to saying, how have you lived up until now? So how you've lived up until now makes a difference. How your business has performed up until now gives you a track record on how you're doing. So if you've smoked for the first 40 years of your life, the chances of you being exposed to lung cancer later on, even if you stop now, are higher than somebody who hasn't. So past performance matters, but it's forward looking by nature. And essentially what it does is it says, what would an investor or a financial buyer or buyer of your business be prepared to pay for your business? And it's a function of two things. What profits does your business make now and into the future? And how certain is it that you're going to continue to make those profits now and into the future? So it's two actually very simple things. And there's also terminology that gets thrown around in the accounting and the business world. You'll hear things like discounted cash flow and earnings multiples and all these sort of really confusing terminologies. But in simple terms, is your business making money? And can you repeatedly make that money into the future? Now, with medical practitioners, it's often quite a difficult concept, because a lot of people go into the health sciences because they want to help people, they want to heal the sick, they want to do all of that. But valuation's kind of it's a numbers game. So you need to understand the basics of, am I making money? And then there's a part that I'll touch on a little bit just now is, if you are the person who's making the money, so if you're a one person practice, it's often very hard. If somebody else is going to buy that, are they buying a job? Are they going to be doing all the work? Or is somebody else doing the work? So when you value a business, one of the single most important things is that business dependent on you? So if you are the person doing all the work, it's often very hard when somebody buys that business. What are they buying from you? They're not buying, certainty of income and revenue. They're buying a job, which is very different to somebody buying, I'll use an example, let's say a pathology practice where you've got a lab and you've got technicians and you've got all those people doing the work, but the owner of the pathology practice is actually just overseeing that. So I'm using that as an example, and we'll probably dive into a bit of that a bit later. But yeah, those are just some important concepts to think of in terms of, why would you want a valuation? And then how do you think about valuation? It comes down to, are you making money? And can you repeat that into the future? And what would somebody be prepared to pay for that?
So some of the things you mentioned about why you would want a valuation that I'd never even thought of. So one of it is, the thing that you spoke about, insurance, because I do a lot of these collaborations with like insurance houses, malpractice insurance, but more importantly, like critical illness. And like you said, how do you insure your business? And I never even thought of that. Like they obviously have to base how much they insure you on what your business is, what you would loss in earnings or whatever the case may be. And I never even thought of that concept of evaluation also being important for that. But then
Yeah,
also
yeah.
you mentioned a really important thing about, if you are starting a practice and you are a solo practice owner and you are doing the clinical work, you basically are the. It also then brings in that topic around like business structure and the type of business, whether you're a sole prop or a PTY. Can you maybe just touch on a little bit in terms of how that actually impacts or influences the valuation of a business if you are sole prop versus an E?
Sure. So let me just touch on something first. And I just want to make this distinction before I go into the structure. You kind of have to decide upfront, are you self-employed or are you building a business that is sellable that somebody else would want to buy?
Mm,
And in the health sciences, a lot of people listening to this may actually never be building a sellable business. They may be building self-employment. Okay. And there's nothing wrong with that. Um, but if you're building self-employment, and that basically means you're working for yourself, you get an income, then you must have this expectation that when you get to 60, you're going to sell your one-man practice and retire off the proceeds of the sale. You need to think of it as having a job, obviously with a bit more flexibility and all of that. And you need to think about over time putting away savings and what have you to save for your pension. I just want to make that point right up front. And that's absolutely fine if that's what you want to do. We, I guess, are talking today around, hey, I actually want to build something that I can sell. And is it sellable and all of those good things? And as I said to you up front, one of the first things is what is the separation from you as the owner or the founder of the business? So when you talk about different structure, a sole proprietor versus let's call it a company, I'm just going to keep it simple. You can have partnerships and other structures, but the reality is, legally speaking, a company has got separation from the owner. You can have different shareholders, you can employ people, got its own sort of tax structure, and typically that sort of psychological separation of saying I'm setting things up in a company normally also kind of leads to saying, okay, how am I building something that exists independent of me as the practitioner or the owner? Okay, there may be tax benefits and all that sort of thing to do that, and there may be other reasons to do that. Whereas a sole proprietor, usually the mindset of one is I'm operating as a sole proprietor. So it doesn't, in terms of business value, typically, you know, if you're going to be bought out by a business, it probably would make a difference. If you've set up as a company, there's a whole bunch of structure and process you need to go through. You need to file annual returns. You need to have accurate accounting records. You need that as an individual as well. But that sort of structure and routine of setting up a company usually means that you're thinking about the things that you need to in terms of building a more valuable business. So it's not to say that a company is more valuable than being a sole proprietor. It's more a mindset thing as to why you do that and what the implications of that are.
mm. But I like this. The thing that you initially said was to make it clear that it's really about looking at whether you are employing yourself or whether you are building a business. And it reminds me of something that Vusi Timbekwayo, I saw one of his talks once, and he spoke about the difference
Mm,
between being an entrepreneur and being a business owner. Where, I mean, and most entrepreneurs these days are just self employed or freelancers, glorified freelancers with a business structure around them. But a true business owner actually makes themselves not be like the critical part in the business. They're more like the visionary and leading strategy and all of that stuff. So it just reminds me, that this is something that I've also always said to a lot of practitioners who I consult with or mentor, is that actually before you even get your practice number and all of that, when you decide to start the practice, first ask yourself, why are you starting the practice? Then ask yourself, what is your long term vision in terms of what it is that you're building? And like you said, there's nothing wrong. I personally, in my practice, I'm not looking to build a big business asset that I want to sell for lots of money. I'm happy to just be me so that one day, if tomorrow I decide I don't want to do this anymore, I can just close my doors and that's the end of the story. But if you do
yeah,
want to build like a business that you want to sell eventually and build an asset and all of that, then you need to decide that right up front before you see your first patient, because that's going to impact what decisions you make in how you grow your business. Which brings me
yeah,
to my next question, right? And we will get into the process of what is a valuation process. But I think at this juncture, it's kind of important to look at if you have made that decision that you want to grow a business that you can eventually sell, what are some of the key things that you need to think about or do right at the beginning when you're starting your business, or plan and ahead for, to make sure that you are actually building a practice that has a good value?
Yeah, that's such a fantastic question, and I'm going to talk about five things. Keep it really simple, and none of them really have anything to do but about numbers. But the first one, I'll say this is to build a business of value. What do you need to do? The first one you got to think about is owner independence. That's probably the biggest one. Is the business dependent on you to run and function? So when you look, and I'll try to use medical examples where I can. So when you look in the medical sphere, what businesses are very valuable? If you look at the big hospital groups, whether it's Mediclinic or Netcare or I don't Milomed, I don't want to leave any of them out. What they have is those businesses run independent of the shareholders and the owners of those businesses. So that's where they have value. They're private enterprise. At a smaller scale, you might have a physiotherapy practice where you've got 4 or 5 people working for you. Yes, you're a physio and you oversee them and train them and all of that, but the practice operates without you. So bigger practices where you have people working and doing the work. So owner independence is absolutely key. And you need to think about that. The second one is having sort of effective, what we call effectable and effective and scalable processes and systems. So what is the process that a customer experiences when they come to you? So how do we talk about onboard your customers. So when a customer comes to you, what system have you got for actually jotting down their details, following up with them? Have you had your health check every year? That sort of practice management software is really important because that allows you to grow. So if you're a counselor and you've got 5 clients, you may not need that. But if you've got 50 clients, how do you keep track of that? How do you touch base with those clients over time? So having systems and processes that can help you run and grow the business is really important. The third one is possibly quite controversial in the medical space because a lot of doctors and medical professionals they're healthcare workers. They want to help people. And when you go through your training, you're not necessarily taught about how do you create value. So something around pricing. We talk about what we call unit economics. So what are you charging the customer and what does it cost for you to provide that service? And that's what does your rent cost you? Your receptionist, all those sorts of things are the costs that go into that. So often, what happens when you take leave? Okay, so what a lot of medical professionals do is they say, I'm going to charge X for a consultation, but they don't factor in that they actually need 3 weeks holiday themselves and then their income stops. So you need to think about what are your actual costs to serve the customer and then what are you charging the customer? So this is quite a tricky one because you have medical aid rates, and a lot of people and doctors think, well, they can only charge the medical aid rate. But actually, if you look at very successful practices, they often charge a lot more than that. Okay, so they have the medical aid rate and they have the cash rate and they have the sort of other rate. So you don't necessarily need to constrain yourself to that. You might choose for a portion of your business. Maybe you're serving a lower income community and you kind of want to offer some of your services at a more affordable rate. Cool. But there's nothing wrong with charging more if you've got great service, you've got experience, you've got all of those sorts of things. So you need to think about that. Are you charging the right amount? Is it fair? And are you costing your inputs correctly? And the fourth one is we talk about the understanding of your customer. Now, this is in business terms, but from medical terms, you need to understand like what kind of practice are you actually offering. Okay, so if you're a general practitioner, a neighborhood general practitioner, and you're dealing with seasonal colds and flus and all of that sort of thing, it's one thing. Okay, you understand who your customer is. You understand that for them, bedside manner matters. You build a rapport with your customers. If you are, let's call it I don't know, a sports scientist and you helping elite athletes perform at the top level so that they can make the Springbok rugby team, okay, your client is very different. That's a medical, biokineticist. There you might be able to charge a lot more. You might be able to actually charge the rugby academy, for instance, a fee so that they can have access to the best, training professionals. So I'm using those kind of quite diverse examples, but understanding who is your actual customer and what problem are you solving for them. Again, to use that local neighborhood GP, sometimes actually they just want assurance to say, actually, there's nothing wrong with you, and have a chat to their doctor once a year so they know they can go on. Okay. And then the last one, if you're thinking of selling a business, is can you actually build a business that generates sufficient profits? And is the market big enough to actually justify somebody paying a lot for that? Okay, so when somebody's buying your business, they're looking at that and they're saying, well, actually, can I make these profits and how do I grow those profits into the future? Now, doctors don't tend to think about that. Often they think about just, let's call it, treating the symptoms. And it could be the same with, and also, there's something you have to think about here is you're dealing with the health professions code. So, in a normal business, you talk about this concept of what we call annuity income. How do you keep the customer coming back? Now, in the medical space, let's say you're a psychologist, okay, you've got an ethical dilemma there because you might be able to complete a course of treatment in 6 sessions, 8 sessions, 12 sessions, depending on the course. And actually, the best course of action is for the customer to go away. Now, if you take a purely business hat on that, then actually you would want that customer to see you. I think the Americans talk about this. You got your regular shrink and you go and you see them every week. They become more a counselor, and there's a space for that. You have life coaches often who charge absolute fortune. I see life coaches who charge 5,000 rand an hour, and then you've got a qualified psychologist who's only charging 1,000 rand for a consultation. And I'm just illustrating that because it is a bit of this sort of dilemma you've got as a medical professional is why are you doing this? And there's certain types of medical fields and practices which are more, they're more prone to having a big market that they can service. I spoke about that a little bit earlier. So things like pathologists, radiologists, those kind of services that serve other doctors and there's a huge demand, those kind of things are typically able to extract more value. It sounds a horrible term to use on your podcast, but yeah, those are some 5 basic concepts that you should think about.
No, I'm glad you bring that up because it is a really big struggle. Because on the one hand, we do have the HPCSA rules, and of course, ethically, we want to avoid over servicing our clients, and we are restricted by how much we can charge, even if we do charge beyond the medical scheme rates. Because the medical scheme rates obviously have to look after their own pockets as well. So it is often less than what the service is worth. But the reality is that is the constraints we are left. And we're actually seeing a lot of health professionals leave the health profession to become life coaches because of that very reason, which is really sad, right? But I think then
Yeah.
that then does ask the question, which I think would be quite interesting to ask, is that as medical practices, I often talk about uh, diversifying your revenue streams beyond what, the clinical service that you kind of restricted in how much you can charge and all of those things. If you have a medical practice, whether it's an OT, physio, psychologist, doctor, whatever it might be, and you have your core clinical services, and you decide to diversify your revenue streams into other things like, let's say, workshops or speaking or maybe doing coaching for those who don't need the medical service, whatever the case may be, would that be something that can then increase the value of your practice if you kind of lump it together under the same business structure?
Tasneem, I love that example, and I'm going to go back. My kids are now 16 and 13, but I remember when they were little, we went for a first aid course for parents. And the lady who ran that was actually, I can't remember where she worked, but she was a nursing sister. And she created a course, a first aid course for parents to cover basic first aid for their kids. She packaged that, she sold that. I think eventually she built an online version of that. And that's a great example of she wasn't just, in her case, she was employed as a nurse and her employer allowed that. But that's a good example of where you can create that extra value and you can then franchise that and you can sell that and you can grow that. So those ideas are great ideas. Sometimes, yeah, I said a lot of medical professionals don't want to move too far from what they do. They want to stick at what they're doing. I'll use another example and maybe this is in the dentistry space. I want to use 2 examples if I may. There are dentistry practices which have done really well at, let's call it, process sizing orthodontics, so braces and all of those sorts of things. My daughter's been through this, so I can kind of explain that. We've got our normal dentist, and when she needed to get her braces, we went to a practice that specialized in that. And they had the owner who was kind of separated from that, but they had a great process for every time my daughter went for a braces adjustment. It was great. She went to this wonderful space. It was like going to this Zen spa kind of thing. And they created this process and this experience for customers. You need to start using the terminology customers rather than patients. It's a subtle difference, but when you start using that terminology, you're thinking more like customer satisfaction and all those things. But she built this whole process around braces. She implemented a payment plan that said, hey, instead of paying 40,000 Rand for the braces, it's an 18-month process and it's 1,000 Rand a month. Okay, so I'm using that as a really good example because that kind of demonstrated some of these things coming together. And then also in terms of practices where often value gets created, it sounds quite technical, but in the UK, where we do a lot of business as well, there's this notion of what they call roll-ups, private equity roll-ups. So what happens is a funder, somebody with lots of money, will go and buy 10 dental practices, for argument's sake, and they'll create a practice called, and in the UK, there's a famous one known as Dentex. They'll then create standard processes for all the dentists that operate within that. Some of those practice guys might actually go into the management team, so they kind of create a consortium of dentists, and then they standardize the processes across that. So everybody's got the same management system. So they reduce the costs of delivering the services, and then that creates value. So those kind of roll-ups are also something that can happen where, it hasn't really come to South Africa to the same extent, maybe with some of the private hospital groups, yes, but those are kind of three examples where I think in terms of thinking about value. Ancillary services, how do you take those? How do you create knowledge around that? I mean, you've got your podcast at the end of the day. I don't even know whether that makes money or not, but for example, it could. Okay. You may have people knocking on your door saying, hey, can we sponsor your podcast? So that's a great example of diversification. The second one, as I said, is around, can you do something in terms of aggregating, saving costs, standardizing processes?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, it speaks to also this idea that within the HPCSA rules, we're also very limited in terms of what we can name our practice and who can be shareholders in our practice and who we can employ, who can we join forces with, all of that stuff. But there is this concept of creating a utility structure that provides the non-clinical services that your practice then practices within. And that's possibly like what you're talking about, that's similar to the UK in that we might not be allowed in South Africa to have a funder that's not a medical professional, create this kind of a consortium. But what we could do is have a funder create a container of a utility kind of brand that then practitioners operate under. And, if you're part of that, what you're actually doing is buying into that greater structure.
Correct.
And that obviously is what you're talking about, increasing the value. But I want to get into the meat and potatoes of evaluation. So let's maybe start with what is the process of getting your practice, getting a valuation for your practice. So I'm coming to you now. I'd like to do a valuation. What is the process you would typically take me through?
Okay, so typically, if you want to value the business, you'd come to us, and I'm not going. I'm going to talk in principles rather than actually go, through our platform. We've got a couple of options for business owners or practice owners. We've got a version where we can do a valuation in as little as half an hour. It's all done online. We've got a platform that we use. We've got a more consultative-based approach, which takes usually about a week. And we have a consultation, an hour and a half consultation with you up front, and then a session with you afterwards. The one is more akin to a GP visit. The other is more like going to a specialist. And they're both going to give you the same answer, but the amount of feedback and information that you get from that differs. What do we look at? We've got three ways of valuing the business. Okay, I'm going to use simple terminology. The first is a discounted cash flow. That basically works out what profits are you making and how likely are you to make those in the future. Okay, and we assess that. The second is we call it earnings multiple. So we look more historically and we say, okay, what profits have you made? And other similar practices to yours, what have they sold for? Where they've been sold. And we'll use a comparative-based approach in terms of doing that. And the third one, and this is kind of called the accountant's method, is what's it actually cost you? And what equipment and all of that do you have? So For argument's sake, if you're a radiologist practice, you might have an MRI machine, you might have a CT machine, you might have all this equipment, which is worth a lot of money. And that's called your sort of net asset value. And you might still owe money to the bank on that. That's called the net asset value method. So we look at those three methods. In terms of process, effectively, we need to know, and I didn't touch on this earlier, one of the fundamental things is, do you have accurate accounting records on your practice? Okay, this is really important, not just because you need to be tax compliant and all of that, but visibility of your business is important, and having a proper record keeping is something a lot of doctors forget about. I use the word doctors loosely. My tax is taken care of. But if you want to sell your business, you need proof. You need that medical history, in accounting terms, of what's happened in the past. So what we do is we assess your current financial status. Okay, we look at your financial statements or your management accounts, or if you don't have that, we have a conversation with you around how many clients do you have, what's your monthly revenue, what are your monthly costs, how much are you making. Then we have a conversation with you, or we go into, okay, tell us about the customers you're serving. How many of them are repeat customers? Are you operating in an area where if you're a sports biokineticist and you're working next to, I don't know, the Marty's rugby field, maybe you've got lots of repeat customers, okay, as opposed to being stuck out somewhere in the Boerland where there's no rugby happening. So we assess your client base. In the medical space, is it an aging client base? Is it a young client base? So we look at who you're serving. We ask some questions around what systems and processes you've got. We look at things like, how dependent is the practice on you? And we ask that question. What happens if you take a 3-week holiday? What happens to your practice? And then we have some discussions around, what are your expectations for your practice? Okay, is it growing? Is it contracting? A town in the middle of the Karoo where the population has halved in the last 10 years, as opposed to you're in an up-and-coming suburb and there's lots of new families with young kids and all of that, to use an analogy. But, so that's effectively the process we go through. We have a conversation with you as the client. And at the end of that, we give you a valuation range that says, this is what we think a third-party buyer would be prepared to pay for your business. And it's always a range. It's never, when you think of blood testing, you have a range of outcomes. If your cholesterol is between 3 and 4, you're good. If it's between 5 and 7, you kind of need to do something about it. And if it's above 10, well, then, you need to go to the ER straight away, kind of thing. So we do a similar thing with the valuation, and that's effectively the process. It's not difficult, but it is structured, and it does focus both on the numbers and the operational side of the practice.
So I want to then look at now looking at it through the lens of the buyer versus the seller. Because, okay, let's say we go through that whole process and you say, okay, this is what your business valuation is between this and this range. This is what people would be willing to buy it for. But explain to me, like, in really simple terms. I'm just thinking now, like, of, all this Shark Tank, Dragon's Den shows we watch, and they say, oh, we're offering you this percent. Then they're like, oh, explain that concept of, if I buy this pen for 5 Rand, and then you buy this because that's the value of a pen, you buy it from me for 5 Rand. But that's not the idea, right? Because I need to make something off it, but you also need to be able to make money off that in the future. So how do I then decide whether you need to buy this from me for 10 Rand or 20 Rand or 30 Rand? That's the part that I think most people struggle with, is like, if this is how much the business is worth, how much should I sell it for, or how much is worth me buying it for?
So I'm going to deal with what we call, just explain the concept of what we call a financial investor. Okay. So you get what you call a financial investor and a strategic investor. But typically, a financial investor is somebody who's got, let's say they've got 5 million Rand to spend and they want to buy something with that. Okay. And a financial investor is looking for a return on that money. Think about, I'll use an analogy like in the property space. If you want to buy an investment property, why do you buy that investment property? You're not buying it because you want to live in the house. You're buying it because you want to make a return from that. And that return is what we call the required rate of return. An investor takes their 5 million Rand and they say, how risky is this investment? And how much money am I going to make from it? So that 5 million Rand, they've got a choice what they could do with that. A buyer of a business, they could go and put that money in a fixed deposit and earn 6% interest a year. Or they could go and buy shares on the stock exchange and earn X% a year. And that's what they're looking at here. A financial buyer is looking for a return on their money. It's a financial decision. And that's what we call the required rate of return or the discount rate. So the riskier the business you're buying, usually, if there's more risk associated with that, they're going to require a higher rate of return to compensate them for that risk. Okay. So that's the way a buyer would look at it. They would look at it unemotionally, almost from a financial point of view. Also, that financial investor does not want to be working 15-hour days like they did as a medical intern in Baragwanath Hospital, or 18-hour days, or whatever it is nowadays. Okay, they want that money to work for them, and that's very much the way, from a valuation point, they look at it. The profit you're making, and when we talk about the profit the practice is making, that's after. Let's say a financial buyer buys a practice. They might say, "I'm not going to work in this, but I'm going to hire a doctor to run the practice for me." You've got to make sure that in those profits, you factored in what it costs to pay somebody else to run the business. And so you look at all those things and you say, in the ordinary course of business, if this business operates independently, how much profit will it make? And then looking forward, can we grow that? Have we got processes to find new customers? Have we got a good reputation? If you've got a bad reputation, your patients are going to go to the doctor next door, not to you. Through that lens is the way that a financial buyer looks at it. You also get, and they will typically, just to use an example, it's an outcomes-based measure. They'll assess that, but typically, those kind of businesses will sell between 3 to 5 times the kind of annual profits in the business if all those other things are in place. Because if your profit is R1 million, you might get 3 to 5 million rand for your practice. I'm using a very simplified example. From a seller's perspective, though, unfortunately, the sellers are often very emotionally attached to their business. And there's a lot of sort of hearsay that goes out. Oh, my friend sold his practice for 10 million rand. I studied with him. I've been doing the same thing as him for the last 30 years. Mine must also be worth 10 million rand. Okay. But what they don't necessarily know is that, maybe his friend's practice happened to be next to a new private hospital that came up, and that private hospital needed to have, I don't know, an orthodontist serving their clientele, so they were prepared to pay for that. That's what we call a strategic buyer. Okay, so no two practices are the same, and that's often where sellers get confused. They think, oh, just because somebody else sold for that, mine's worth the same. You have to go, Tasneem, I could put you next to somebody else who's the same age as you, same height as you, looks very similar to you, but actually you've got completely different eating, exercising habits, genetic history, all of those sorts of things. And businesses are the same. And sellers or practice owners often get emotionally attached to their business. And also, quite frankly, ignorant. That they don't understand necessarily the financial aspects. And that's why having a good accountant or an advisor or somebody who can help you with that is really important. So if you're serious about your health, if you're serious about wanting to live longer, you're probably going to go after 45. You're probably, as a male, going to go for that annual checkup. If you're not going to bother. And I think that's really important from a seller's point of view. Educate yourself, understand what you need to do to make your business worth more. And don't just get hung up on the hearsay at the spa or the golf club or the running club or wherever you're chatting to fellow professionals about what they sold their business for. So hopefully that gives a little bit of guidance and clarity to people listening.
Yes, and you know what? I think the key thing that you said there was the emotion aspect, because I think that the confounding variables of why that is an emotional decision is because maybe it's this idea that I put all this time and effort into building this practice, and maybe they in the first place didn't run the practice effectively or efficiently to build their own personal wealth. Maybe they also, like you said in the beginning, didn't think about like retirement plans, and that's why I do a lot of that collaborations with the financial institutions about, because you're self-employed, a lot of health professionals maybe don't think about putting away for an RA or having the critical illness cover, all of those things, and they're living sort of paycheck to paycheck or drawing from the business. So it feels like if they sell it for little, that it's like they got nothing out of all that years. Like maybe they've had the practice for 10, 20 years. And it's like, if I don't get a lot for it, then it's like I wasted my time, because what do I have to show for it? But that
Exactly.
reminds me of this thing of like, there's this term that gets thrown around a lot, especially for those kind of practice where it's, the person is, where, like you said, that they're actually self-employed and now they want to sell their practice. And the term that gets thrown around a lot is this term of goodwill. So can you explain what exactly is goodwill, and what place does it have in valuating, valuation of a business?
Okay, so I'm going to use the accounting definition of goodwill. I explained a little bit earlier that you have what you call your net asset value of the business. The net asset value is the sum of all the assets and all the equipment that you might own. So if you own the building, you own your table, your dentistry equipment, or whatever it is, okay, and the money that you own, the cash in bank, and all of that. That's your net asset value of the business assets, if you want to call it that. Goodwill is simply the difference between what you sell the business for and those values. So if you've built a business which is valuable, in other words, it's growing, it's got good cash profits, it's got all those things. The future value of those profits, translated in today's terms, is worth more than the value of the net assets. That difference is called goodwill, and it's a common misconception because people. I'll use another example. Let's say you've got 30,000 or 300,000, 300 million linked, not LinkedIn, let's use the word Instagram followers. Just because you've got 300 million Instagram followers doesn't mean that you're going to be wealthy. If you're Kim Kardashian and you've got 300 million Instagram followers, you've got a business empire because they've figured out how to leverage that and trade off their brand and sell products and all of that sort of thing. So good will only exist if you're able to convert that into profits and future profits. Um, and I think people think, oh, I've got this loyal customer base that's worth a lot. Well, it isn't necessarily worth a lot. What I do want to touch on, though, and maybe I can just segue a little bit, we talk about value drivers and value detractors. Um, the broader sort of concept of what we call intangible assets. So there's goodwill, but in the medical space, we often talk about IP or trade secrets or processes or whatever. So those things can have a lot of value. And the big pharma and the big pharmaceuticals often own IP to different medicines, and you have about the medical patents and all of those sorts of things. So
Mm,
if as a practice owner you come up with a novel way or treatment methodology, for argument's sake, and you can patent that and you can protect that, and then you can share that with other doctors or other practitioners on how to use that. That can create IP value, intellectual property, and that could be super valuable. You might not be able to scale that and roll that out, but you might find one of the big medical group comes and says, "Oh wow, you, Mr. Doctor, have come out with this novel way. We're going to roll that out to all 1,000 doctors across our practice. We want to acquire you so that they can all benefit from that technology." So that is something which is IP and can have value beyond just sort of the cash flow it generates for you, because to somebody else, they can take that and leverage it across a bigger footprint, so to speak. So, I don't want to lose the audience, but I think that's quite important.
mm,
And then I want to just touch on something when we talk about sort of value detractors, okay, or negative things. Is there are two that I want to touch on. One is sort of the sort of high customer dependence. I'm going to use a very simple example. You might be a doctor that likes working with people the same age as you. So you build this great family practice, or let's call it family practice, but your audience or your clients are an aging population. So when you were 20, they were 20. Now you're operating in this area. You're 65. All your clients are 65, but you've got no children's practice. You've got no, middle-aged people with families and all of those sorts of things. So you need to evolve your business as it grows. And you'll find a lot of successful practices do that. Dentists have often done that. In the past, you went to your dentist and they did everything from cleaning your teeth to the fluoride treatment to the braces. Now, what tends to happen is you go to a dentistry practice and there's an oral hygienist who does the cleaning of your teeth, and they charge separately for that. The dentist does this, and then if you want a root canal, you go to somebody else in the practice. What all those things do is they kind of disaggregate and remove that sort of customer dependency, but they also create additional value streams. And then I touched on this a little bit earlier, is this thing of accounting records. I can't emphasize this enough. Okay. You got to have the accounting records. You got to have the proof to show, you know, how your business is performing. And that's a big value detractor when you don't have that and someone wants to buy your practice. Because everyone knows the medical professionals are notoriously bad when it comes to keeping
Yeah.
proper accounting records. You're not
Yeah.
trained in that. So anyway, I'm going on a bit of a tangent, but hopefully I answered the Goodwill question and then
Yeah.
added a couple of things to that. So yeah, I mean, if there's any questions
No,
around that,
I'm
I'm
glad
sure
you
you'll make
brought
my
up the
details available, and I'm more than happy to share that with anyone.
I'm glad you brought up the thing about the accounting records, because and I was laughing when you mentioned it the first time, because I can't tell you how many practice owners are just, relying on their little Excel spreadsheet. They don't even have an accountant. Maybe once a year they'll you have a tax consultant, but they don't. They're still doing the invoicing, sending like a paper, like a template, and then just changing it all the time. And it's so important. And yes, it is true that we weren't trained in that, but these days this generation have the advantage of technology. Like, it's not like back in the day. Nowadays accounting softwares are easy. And also, then, if you don't want to do your own accounting, have your own accounting software, having
Outsource
a
it.
bookkeeper, an accountant that will then keep those records for you is so important. I always said, like, that was one of the first, when you're deciding which, you have a limited amount of resources you need for outsourcing. What was the first sort of outsourced service that I invested in was an accountant, because I'm like, I'm not dealing with all this bookkeeping stuff. So it is really important. So the last question I have for you is then, if you are looking to buy a practice, and I've had a few different people ask me variety of questions. One is, maybe they're working in the practice and the owner is retiring and asked if they'd like to buy the practice. That's one example. Or somebody advertised that they have a practice for sale, and now they're really interested because it's the type of practice they want. So you go and you look at this practice. You've spoken about having your own evaluation done for your own business. Is it advisable for somebody who's looking to buy to do their own independent valuation, or is it okay to just kind of trust what that person's accountant has said? And what are some of the red flags you need to look out for when looking to buy a practice?
Yeah, I think that's really really important, and I think independence is absolutely critical. So if you're looking to buy a practice, it's always advisable also to have your own independent valuation done on that. And we do that too. We do both sides. I mean, I think where we sit is we independent and we don't take sides. Often we get customers coming to us jointly, both the buyer and seller, and saying, "Hey, look, we want an independent view, so we've got a starting point to negotiate." That's fine. It doesn't always have to be a game, but usually the buyer would do a valuation and the seller would have an expectation, and then you kind of negotiate around that. And I think the reason why that expert is important is because there's a lot of, yeah, I'm sure in the medical experience, a lot of doctors grapple with this and physiotherapists, whatever. There's Dr. Google nowadays, So what a lot of people
Yeah.
do is they go to Dr. Google and they're like, they come in with some symptoms and they tell the doctor that they're dying from stage 4 cancer. Sorry to be morbid about it, but actually the doctor looks and says, actually, no, you're not, and we play a very similar role in that. The other concept is one of getting a second opinion, which is a very valid medical term. You don't get a second opinion because you don't trust your doctor, but sometimes these things are sensitive, and sometimes and a different professional might look at it from a different angle. And often medical professionals work in teams, right? You have a trusted circle, and my GP will often say to that, look, like, this is my view, but like, I would advise that you get a second opinion on this because that's not really my area of expertise, or you'll refer to a specialist for argument's sake. So I think that concept applies here. As a buyer, I would do exactly the same thing. I would say, look, I'm thinking of buying this practice, and that person would help kind of just assess where some of those things are, like the red flags, for instance. Yeah, we would want to see the accounting records of the practice. Okay, we would want to understand what the client base looks like. If the prospective practice is not prepared to share that information, that's a red flag. Okay, because they're not prepared to share that, then how's the potential buyer meant to make an objective view or assessment of that? And obviously, you sign NDAs and confidentialities and all of those good things, but that's a red flag. I think, yeah, often where, you know, a red flag in the medical space might be if the doctor's too busy to have a conversation around this, because, he is the business. Those are the things we
Yeah.
talk about there. And yeah, I mean, it's, there's probably 1,000 different things that you could look at, but I guess a trained professional would help you isolate what those things are. And and that professional should be able to explain both to the buyer and the seller in plain language what it means. And again, I'm going to use a medical example as well. If I go to my doctor and he says, your blood tests are XR, Y minus Z on a scale of whatever, I'm going to look at him. If he says to me, listen, actually, you don't have enough oxygen in your blood because your lungs aren't working properly. I'm using a stupid example.
Yeah.
Okay. And then what do I need to do about that? Okay. You need to do some cardio every day so that you can improve your lung capacity. So that professional is going to help you assess the business, what's fair, and then also that can go back to the seller to say, okay, well, look, this is what you need to do to make this business, make this deal happen, so to speak. So yeah, we could probably spend a 2-hour podcast just on negotiating a deal and how you pay for it and
Yeah.
all those things. That's not the objective of today, but hopefully today we've just kind of shed a little bit of light on the basics of valuation, why it matters, how you should think about it, how a professional could help you. If a professional makes you feel intimidated or less after you walk out of that conversation with them, maybe they're not the right advisor or professional for you. The role of a professional is to make you, as the sort of the non-professional, the non-expert in that space, help you understand that in simple terms. And I think that at Bizval, that's what we're trying to achieve. And if we're not doing it well, then we need to look at ourselves. How do we do it better? Hopefully, that's not too much of a shameless punt
Yeah.
on what we do, Tasneem. I do like to keep things simple, and again, to offer it out that if anybody's got any questions around their practice, is it sellable, all these things, they're more than welcome to email me or reach out to us, and we'd gladly assist.
No, thank you. I think also, I always say that if you, like people will say to me, oh, but I have to pay to have a valuation. But then I always say, but you are willing to pay all this money for this practice. So you almost have to think, what is the risk factor, right? So if you pay the money for the practice without doing a valuation and it turns out to be a bad business decision, the amount of financial hardship or risk that you're taking on is so much bigger than paying for a valuation and then not buying the business. Do you know
Yeah,
what I mean? Like that. So, and I
you
mean,
absolutely spot on. Yeah, and
then
can I
it's
use a
like,
quick? I know we're almost out of time, but
yeah,
to use a medical analogy, if you've got something seriously wrong with you, you're going to go and have a CT scan done or an MRI scan done. Okay, that MRI scan might cost you, I don't know what they cost nowadays, 6,500 rand, 10,000 rand. Okay, but once you've had that MRI scan done, you know with certainty whether there is a growth in your brain or whatever the case might be. If you don't have that done and that you've got headaches and those headaches persist, you're always left lingering. It's actually a small price to pay. The consequences of not knowing are high. And I think where it gets murky is in the old days, before you know people like Bizval and us were around. Where did you get that kind of information? You would be paying 100,000 rand upwards for evaluation, which is a lot of money, and often it wouldn't be easily explained. It would be done by accountants for accountants dealing with private equity players and all of that.
yeah,
We brought that cost right down to like 5,000 rand for a basic valuation, which is in the grander scheme of things. If you're spending 3 or 4 or 5 million rand on a practice, if you're overspending by 500,000 rand, well, you want to know that up front. 5,000 rand or whatever might be a small price to pay for having that knowledge. So absolutely correct.
yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time. And, you did mention, I'm just going to show up here your contact information. So if anybody wants to get hold of you, they can reach you at the address that is on the screen. But also, I will put all your links because I see you also have some links to like videos and your website and all of that stuff. I'll put all of that in the description box below this interview. But is there anything else you want to share about what you guys offer, or any information about anything upcoming or services or things like that?
Tasneem, I think you've touched on everything already. I mean, I think you can gather from today's chat is our primary objective is to help business owners, practice owners, buyers or sellers make better decisions for them, to either grow the value of their practice, understand where they're at. So you on our website, www.bizvalglobal.com, there's a resources section. We've got lots of videos explaining valuation in more general terms. So I'd encourage anybody who's got time, go have a look at that and reach out to us. I think, an offer to you and to the team, it might be quite cool at some point to do a bit of a masterclass with medical practitioners where we do that. We get somebody to actually value their practice and we do a live valuation and we go through the process. I mean, that's something we could certainly do. But yeah, for us, it's about education first and foremost. We're just really passionate about helping people make better decisions. So yeah, that's all I want to say. And Tasneem, thank you so much for reaching out to us. If one person hears us today and it makes a difference, in their financial planning or wherever they're going, I think we've achieved what we set out to achieve today. So the door is always open, and really love just chatting to you and having this opportunity.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Tasneem.